I invite you to join with me in reading number 593 in your gray hymnal. "593, Liberation is Costly," from Bishop Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And I will read the plain type if you'll join in with the italics. Liberation is costly. Even after the Lord had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, they had to travel through the desert. They had to bear the responsibilities and difficulties of freedom. There was starvation and thirst, and they kept complaining. They complained that their diet was monotonous. Many of them preferred the days of bondage and the flesh pots of Egypt. We must hold hands and refuse to be divided. We must be ready. Some of us will not see the day our liberation is with. But those people will have contributed to the struggle. Let us be united. Let us be filled with hope. Let us be those who respect one another. In Forbes magazine a few years ago, one of its contributors wrote about the key to creativity for those serving time in prison. August Turak wrote, "As mortal human beings, time is our scarcest resource, and this precious resource is the price that a prisoner is willing to invest." The prisoner is not just willing to invest time, he is doing time. And we usually fail to reach our own creative potential because we are unwilling to make time. Every religious tradition strives for freedom, he writes, whether it is the freedom from sin of Christianity, the freedom from ignorance of Buddhism, or the freedom from ego identification that marks the allegory of Plato's cave. The longing to be free from the prison of selfishness has sent many people either literally or figuratively into the desert, looking for that back-against-the-wall urgency that is so critical to creativity, he writes. To reach our full potential, it is not necessary or even advisable that we abandon the world. But, he says, I can guarantee that the more energy you apply to freeing yourself, the more creative you will become in life. Coping as prisoners do with the existential paradox of a free mind and an imprisoned body is the drive behind the writings we will hear this morning. Striving for freedom and for an understanding of the incarceration being endured, the creativity of prisoners is at once poignant and immensely disturbing, especially when those writers are imprisoned unjustly. It would be one thing to write knowing that you have been rightfully tried and convicted for a crime you committed, but entirely another when your arrest and imprisonment is due to persecution, repression, or wholesale extermination of a people. It's appropriate at this time of year for us to hear the words of a few of those unjustly imprisoned in our recent history. On March 30th, 1960, Nelson Mandela was one of thousands detained by the South African government in a state of emergency imposed after the Sharpeville massacre, one of several instances of arrest and imprisonment for him leading up to the 27 years he served, for the most part, on Robben Island, off the coast of Cape Town. The Holocaust Remembrance Day was this past Thursday, April 12th. And the 55th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail is tomorrow, April 16th. The Auschwitz poems, edited by Adam Zeich in 2011, is, as you can see, a thick volume of 400 poems by 250 poets who come from a range of nationalities, firstly Polish, but also other European countries. And they include Jews, Gypsies, and Christians. And we know, of course, that the Nazis had a long list of peoples they were determined to erase from the face of this earth. This morning, I'd like to share 4 poems from this collection. The Camp by Zofia Grochokalska-Abramowicz. A Letter in the Night by Stanislas Wygotsky. An Auschwitz Childhood by Adam Zwiper. And The Survivor by Eric Fried. The Camp. First it was rebellion and despair, bitter tears and quiet crying, and a pain of longing, throbbing in the heart, and later from hours and days that lined up into rows, grew months of misery. From months, time spread into years, and I still do not understand, unable to tell that it is I, me alone, that pitiful number, gray blot. And around me the days are flowing just the same. Hunger, assembly, lashing, boredom, work. Somebody disappeared from where nobody comes back. Camp days, days all the same. Behind the barbed wire, days, days all the same. Someone betrayed, red-hot chimney. Someone was beaten, kicked, bloodied. Horrible, sticky days, days all the same. And we, striped people, all the same. Already unresponsive, without faith, blunt to suffering, to which there is no end. People robots, all the same. Wires, stripes, chimney, torture, work, sunny days, rainy nights, unimportant, always similar. Rebellion, hatred, resignation, work, so awful, so terrible. I am just like a plant that grows near the road, covered with dust from a passerby. I perish in the dust. Hope is vanishing. A Letter in the Night. Somewhere among the ruins of my town wanders my only daughter, her eyes cast down. She is in rags. She is hungry and she shivers. Perhaps you will meet her near the river. And she is lonely and she is hungry and she cries, and she knows it can't be otherwise. She walks slowly, stealthily, like a thief in the yard where we used to live. But the yard is a desert of stone, and she freezes and she is hungry and alone. And lonesome, she stands close to the wall in the yard where she once lost her ball. And she hides in a basement like in a lair, and she is full of anxiety and despair. The wind is blowing and fear is creeping, and she is lonely and hungry and she is weeping. The sky is lead and the river is ice, and she knows it will not be otherwise. But she is still going to the station, and she asks there for information. And she searches the train on the track, and she hopes that her mother and I shall come back. And she comes once, and she comes twice, and she comes many times, and she is lonely and hungry, and she cries, and she knows it can't be otherwise. Shivering passengers are walking by fast, but she is standing and sticks to the last. The wind is blowing and the snowflakes dance. My only daughter, should you meet her perchance in the wind, in the frost, in the snow, tell her that today still I cry for that little girl who was burned in an oven in Auschwitz long, long time ago. An Auschwitz childhood. You were a wise child, knowing that crying is not allowed. You were silent because every sound could mean the end of your living non-existence. You knew to give way to the stronger, and no one was weaker than you. You kicked your mother in the shins when she staggered and shivered in the cold, staying in the rows of living ghosts. You were a wise child, knowing that you must stand at attention for hours on morning roll calls in wintertime, hoping that the Aufseher will pity you, giving you another rotten potato. Fear was mightier than all other childhood reactions, but when the night covered the smelly barracks, people like lobsters before being boiled crowded each other tightly. For a moment you have regained your voice, asking, like a child, Mom, what does it mean, an apple? Mom, what does it mean, a chicken? Mom, what does it mean, a human being? The survivor after Auschwitz. Luck wishes me into this good fortune that I live. What is life after so much death? The guilt of innocence, the counter-guilt that weighs as heavy as the guilt of the slayer, as the blood guilt of the forgiven, the blame shifters. How often do I have to die for the fact that I did not die there? It's so moving to hear especially these poems that express the concern and care about their children. Nelson Mandela wrote a letter to his daughters on the occasion of the arrest of his wife, Winnie Mandela, in 1969. She was detained for 5 months, and here's an excerpt from his letter, dated the 23rd of June, 1969. My darlings, once again, our beloved mummy has been arrested, and now she and daddy are away in jail. My heart bleeds as I think of her sitting in some police cell, far away from home, perhaps alone and without anyone to talk to and with nothing to read. 24 hours of the day, longing for her little ones. It may be many months or even years before you see her again. For long may you live like orphans without your own home and parents, without the natural love, affection, and protection Mummy used to give you. Now you will get no birthday or Christmas parties, no presents or new dresses, no shoes or toys. Gone are the days when, after having a warm bath in the evening, you would sit at table with Mummy and enjoy her good and simple food. Gone are the comfortable beds, the warm blankets, and clean linen she used to provide. This is not the first time Mummy goes to jail. All that I wish you always to bear in mind is that we have a brave and determined Mummy who loves her people with all her heart. She gave up pleasure and comfort in return for a life full of hardship and misery because of the deep love she has for her people and country. When you become adults and think carefully of the unpleasant experiences Mummy has gone through and the stubbornness with which she has held to her beliefs, you will begin to realize the importance of her contribution in the battle for truth and justice, and the extent to which she has sacrificed her own personal interests and happiness. As I read that letter for the first time, what struck me was that here is a man subjected to intense oppression from the moment he arrives on Robben Island. He wrote in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, "We were met by a group of burly white warders shouting, 'This is the island, here you will die.'" On my visit to Robben Island in 2003, I saw for myself the extreme conditions in which Mandela lived for 18 years. A 6-foot square cell with a bedroll on the floor, a tiny stool, and a ceramic pot. He was fed poorly, wore clothing that barely protected him from wet and windy winters on the Cape, and he was forced to do heavy labor in the lime quarry, where years of the sun's blinding glare on the white walls of the quarry damaged his sight. Mandela wrote, "The challenge for every prisoner, particularly every political prisoner, is how to survive prison intact, how to emerge from prison undiminished, how to conserve and even replenish one's beliefs. The authorities' greatest mistake was to keep us together, for together our determination was reinforced. We supported each other and gained strength from each other." And thus was he able to think compassionately about his wife in her time of imprisonment and his orphaned children, even as he himself experienced a prolonged and brutal existence. Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail was anything but compassionate. Dr. King was kept in solitary confinement after being arrested on the 12th of April 1963 on charges of violating Alabama's law against mass public demonstrations. Deneen Brown wrote in the Washington Post this past January that, quote, "The day after his arrest, 8 prominent white clergy members placed an ad in the Birmingham News accusing King of being an outside agitator whose demonstrations were unwise and untimely." Dr. King began writing in the margins of newspapers, on scraps of paper, paper towels, and slips of yellow legal paper smuggled into his cell. Brown writes that, infuriated by their words, King unleashed his literary wrath on the clergyman. Writing with the light of the sun that fell through the cell's bars, King quoted from memory biblical passages and quotes from Socrates, Martin Luther, Thomas Aquinas, Thomas Jefferson, T.S. Eliot, and St. Augustine to bolster his argument. It's an amazing letter to read. I urge you all to read it in full. But here's just an excerpt. Dr. King wrote, "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their 'Thus saith the Lord' far beyond the boundaries of their hometown, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my hometown." He felt that an emotional and eloquent explanation of his actions would move the clergy to a better understanding of the importance of their support. And he didn't hesitate to draw attention to the white privilege the clergy enjoyed. He wrote, "Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, 'Wait.' But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, When you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters. When you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see the tears welling up in her eyes when she's told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. Dr. King's letter also tried to explain the tension that had arisen between those who did not want to rock the boat and those who wanted full-out revolution. But to me, the most powerful part of his letter, when he accepts the accusation of being an extremist, making it a standard of his faith by which he is challenged to act, he says, "Although I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? Was not Martin Luther an extremist? And John Bunyan and Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So the question, he writes, is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or the extension of justice? Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. And he ends his letter with a sly reminder to the white moderate clergy of what he's enduring. "Never before," he writes, "have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell other than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers?" And of course, it was they who were writing their criticisms from their comfortable desks. His powerful words were smuggled out of the jail. They were published in the New York Post, Ebony Magazine, and in his 1964 memoir. Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, was published in 1990. And despite his deterioration from years of imprisonment, we actually had many years to witness the wisdom and courage that came from those years of exile and imprisonment. We know, of course, that some of the Auschwitz poets died before the camp was liberated in January of 1945. Some survived and were able to publish their writings. In the foreword to the Auschwitz poems, Adam Zike writes, "Creative writing in concentration camps, gulags, and prisons reveal that even in the most difficult conditions, one could and must remain a human being, a creative being." We honor that triumph of the human spirit today. Blessed be. Amen.